Hello, welcome back to my studio. Today we're painting this beautiful daisy. To paint this daisy, we're going to be using masking fluid. So to start off, we're going to be using liquid dish soap. In this case, it's Dawn dish soap. You want to squirt out about a quarter-size puddle and then use a very cheap brush. I found this one at Walmart. And I'm using the Liquid-X masking fluid, but there are many brands that will work just as well. And it's about a quarter size of the masking fluid. I'm coating my brush very well in the dish soap. You can coat it all the way up and past that metal part if you would like, to make sure that all the bristles are coated in the dish soap. And then I am dipping it into the masking fluid and very gently dragging it along the paper so that it leaves a nice and pretty thick layer of masking fluid on the watercolor paper. I'm making sure to cover all the area within the lines that I've drawn. To draw these lines, I used a quarter for that central circle, and then I used the circle of my masking tape to make the outer circle, where I then drew all the petals to touch the inside of that circle. So if you're like me and you're not the best at freehanding, using a quarter and then a larger circle to then draw your petals to makes it easy to draw a more balanced, symmetrical daisy. You can see how thick the masking fluid is, and I keep going back into the very wet masking fluid puddle to make sure that I've covered all the areas. Once you're happy with it, you can go ahead and rinse off your brush. The soap that we coated with it to start off with makes it very easy to be able to wash off the brush so that you can use it again in the future. If you don't coat it with either bar soap or liquid soap first, then the masking fluid will ruin your brush and make it impossible to use again. So now I can use it again in the future. I'm using cadmium yellow light, bright green, and turquoise to start off with. I'm using a 5x7 140-pound cold pressed 100% cotton paper sketchbook, paper towels, and so these are the paintings that I did in preparation for this video, just practice paintings, and you can see how they're very similar, but they're all very different, so expect your paintings to look very different as well. For the sketch of the daisy, I'm doing curved lines down with larger petals towards the bottom of the paper and the base of the flowers, and smaller petals towards the buds or the flowers themselves. And then I also have about 5 little daisies up at the top of the paper where they're just the very simplified forms. And then I am lightening the pencil lines with a kneaded eraser. For this painting, I'm using an oval wash brush, a size 12 round brush, and a size 2 round brush. I really like using the oval wash brush because it holds a lot of water and you're able to cover a lot of space quickly without damaging the paper at all by having to go back and forth many times with a smaller brush. So I'm starting with the water all over the area and then going right into that pan of green and adding it to the wet watered area and just going back in, adding more. You can also take away some by soaking it back up with your dried brush if you'd like. After the first layer is dry, I am making a wash of turquoise blue, and I am making sure it's as dark as I want it to be on a scrap piece of paper. And then what I'm doing is I am painting the background, so around the stems and the leaves. It's also called a negative painting because you're painting in the negative space. Also, you can think of it as just the space around your objects. And that way you're bringing your objects or your flowers, kind of pops it out from the painting. And the shapes that I'm going for are these leaf shapes of the daisy. This is one that has come out of my garden. Unfortunately, they've all passed through prime, so they're looking a little crunchy. But you can see the shapes of the leaves that I'm going for. And if you don't have a daisy, you can cut the shape. You don't have to trace an actual daisy leaf, but you could cut the shape out of a scrap piece of paper. I would use a thicker paper like scrap watercolor paper just because it's easier to trace than, say, a piece of printer paper. And the general shape is just a little bit pointed at the top and then a slight curve on each side. So this is going to be the next layer. So you're going to make sure that your second layer of color that you've just painted in is completely dry before you do this. That way you can erase any pencil marks that you don't like. If you do this while the painting is still damp, you will not be able to go back in and erase those pencil marks, as they will become a permanent part of your painting. I have found that out the hard way a few times, that when you draw it into a damp painting, that those pencil lines will be there forever. So for this next layer, I'm using that same turquoise, but I'm using a thicker version of it. So I'm not using a wash of it. I'm putting a little bit on my plate. You could put it on your palette with just a little bit of water to make sure that it is the darker hue that I'm going for. So it really makes those leaves pop out of the paper, especially towards the bottom of the paper. I really wanted it to be darker so that it gives the painting a sense of depth. And as I go towards the daisy, I'm lightening it up a bit. So I'm gradually putting more and more water on my brush as I go towards the flower itself, but I'm keeping it dark towards the bottom of the paper and also towards the sides, but lightening it up a little bit as I go towards the petals by drying off the paintbrush in between, adding a bit of color or water, and also using the paper towel to soak just a little bit of it back up off of the paper. This isn't necessary. You can add the paint around the petals to be just as dark as the paint around the leaves, or just kind of let it flow and add water and paint as you go and just see what happens. That's a lot of fun to do with this as well. You can also add in paint to the wet areas to make them darker as you go, add water, and then add a little more paint, and just see that fun interaction between the paint and the water, the damp areas, the dry areas. For this background, I think it's fun to have watermarks even, areas where there's a drier area and you're adding in a more wet paint to that area, and so it leaves the lines of a watermark. I think that can look pretty in the background as well. But if you don't like that, what you can do is wait for it to dry and then using a damp brush go over that water line and pick it back up with a paper towel to soften it. So you can really have a bit more freedom with this background, adding paint and water, taking away paint and water. It's just kind of like an ethereal, fun background. You don't have to take it too seriously. Just kind of see what happens with it. Once it is completely dry, you can take away that masking fluid that you added for the daisy and the flowers. I'm using a natural rubber remover, and I bought mine on Amazon. I think it was about $5 or $6 for 4 of these. And what it does is it allows the masking fluid, or it helps the masking fluid to come off of your paper easily, because the masking fluid sticks to it, and you're able to pull up the masking fluid without hurting the paper underneath. And that masking fluid sticks to the natural piece of rubber, and then you can just pick that masking fluid off of that square of natural rubber Um, I think it's kind of fun to do. It can be intimidating at first, but once you've practiced a little bit with it, it really is easy to do. I've sped it up for you as it is a bit boring watching this whole process, but I'm just using it in kind of like a circular motion on the paper, and it picks that masking fluid right up. Now that we've removed our masking fluid, it's time to get into those petals. It's hard to see the circle in the center of the daisy. If you would like to, which I do end up doing in a little bit, I would put that quarter back in there and trace around the quarter so that you can see where your circle is, as the masking fluid sometimes does pull up the pencil line as well, even more than you mean for it to. So now we can paint right away into those white areas. I'm using the same blue that I used as a wash, the turquoise blue. So for the first petal, it's just a very watered down turquoise blue. And then for this next petal, I'm adding in a little bit. It's called sepia, and it's a cool brown. So I'm adding in just a little bit of this cool brown to the turquoise blue. You can use a black for this. You can use a Payne's Gray would be perfect, just a watered down Payne's Gray, or adding a little bit of black to the turquoise and watering that down. You can really play around with watered down colors for this. I've seen it look very pretty with watered down violet. You can put many different colors. I do think it does help for you to see the color as white if you use cooler colors in the petals, so maybe not yellows or other warm colors, but any cool colors that are watered down a lot I think will look very nice for the petals. So watered down purples, watered down blues, watered down or cool browns or Payne's Gray. You can put a little bit of different colors in all the petals, make it more fun and colorful. And then I'm using that same watered down blue brown mix that I have in the little tiny kind of squiggly daisies in the back, just so that they're not quite as bright on the paper. And if I spent longer on this, I'd probably add a little bit more blue as well, just so that they're not quite as bright on the paper, so they would fade a little bit more into the background. But I think it's fun as it is. You don't even have to add any blue back there if you really like that look. And then I'm using that cadmium yellow light as the centers of the daisies, and then also for those daisy buds. I then rinse off my brush and fill in the center circle of the daisy with just water. After I fill it with water, I'm using the yellow cadmium yellow light, and filling in the rest of that circle. I just want to give it a good first layer, as we're going to be making it look a little bit more three-dimensional with a little bit more added detail. And in the same first layer, while it's still wet, I am getting two little piles or puddles of brown ready. The first is a burnt sienna, so it's that red brown, which I'm now mixing with yellow to add into the center of the daisy. And this gives it that more three-dimensional look. And then I'm adding it in little tiny dots around the edge of that center, leaving that top right corner without any of the dots. And then I'm adding some of that darker, cooler brown, which is the sepia. You can use any warm or cool browns that you have. You could also use orange. If you don't have brown, you can mix orange and blue together, which will make a nice brown. But I'm using the burnt sienna, which is the warmer brown mixed with a bit of yellow. And then I'm using the sepia, which is that cool brown, to give it even more depth in the very center and then around the edge as well. So you can play around with this on a scrap piece of paper, just kind of experimenting, maybe trace a quarter, fill it with yellow, and then play with a brown or an orange to see what you can do to make it look more three-dimensional by adding a bit of color to the center and then around the edge. For the daisies at the top right-hand corner, I'm using a very light wash to make it look like there's just a little bit of detail of stems and leaves, just to kind of give it a little bit more, or your eye a little bit more information of what you're looking at. They're not just floating discs, they're flowers in the flower bed. But you can do however you want. You can use a wash of green, a wash of blue, just very, very light. And then now I'm going into that stem of that daisy bud and picking up some of that color to make it more of a smooth, lighter area. And to do this, you just need to dampen your brush, rub it on the area you want to pick up, and then put your paper towel on top of it to pick it back up. To help that daisy in the front stand out from the background, I'm adding a little bit of that cadmium yellow light and putting it right into the stem of that daisy. I have a lot of water on my brush, so it's not super thick paint, so it's still, you can still see the green that's underneath it. And I'm putting it all down the stem and then also adding it to the leaves of the daisy as well. This gives it a glow and helps it to stand out from the background. This technique is called layering or glazing because it's that top layer, but you can still see the other colors coming underneath it. So for this next part, I'm using a little bit more of that turquoise blue, and I'm adding a shadow right underneath the daisy on the stem so that it looks like the sunlight is hitting the daisy from above and it's leaving a bit of a shadow down below. You can use a darker green for this. You could use Payne's Gray to put this in. I like using more bright colors in my shadows. I just think it gives the painting a bit more of a glow, a bit more of a fun, colorful look. And then I'm also going down just the left side of the stem to give it more of a three-dimensional look so that it looks like the stem is popping off the paper just a bit more, and it gives it a bit more interest to the painting. So now we've finished with the stem, we're going to add just a little bit more of a three-dimensional look into the petals of the daisy. And I'm using my size 2 round brush. You can use a size 0 or whatever the smallest brush that you have that's good for details. And I'm using the same turquoise blue with just a little bit of water so that it's not too thick. And I'm drawing out these little tiny lines, just kind of little flicks of my wrist. Little tiny lines coming out from the round area, so starting at the round center area of the flower and then coming out maybe like a half an inch, just a little ways into the petal, not too long of a line, so that looks like it's just kind of a shadow area around the center of the daisy, and it gives the petals just a bit more of a three-dimensional look. I then mix a little bit of the blue with that cool brown, the sepia, together and make sure that it's very, very watered down to give one more layer to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. So I'm adding, while it's still wet, so I don't know actually if it would be considered another layer or just more detail, but I'm adding just a little bit of that warm brown in around the center of the daisy and making just even smaller lines. I'm adding this color into the still damp blue lines that I've already put down so that it gives it just a little bit more depth and looks a little bit more three-dimensional. And again, I'm leaving that right hand top corner without any of the lines or the shadow so that it looks like the sun is coming from the top right hand corner of the paper. So it looks really bright over there, and it looks like the shadow area is in the bottom left hand side. Now I'm adding a little bit more depth to the center of the daisy, and to do this I'm using that burnt sienna and a little bit of water and dabbing it into the center of the daisy. I don't want to have just a circle kind of painted in, but just kind of a blobby area. I then decided it's a little too much, so I dry off my brush a little bit, soak it up a little bit, and then kind of move it around while it's still wet, and decide I need a little bit of a deeper, darker area right in the center. So to do that, I'm using that sepia, which is that cooler brown. You can also use a Payne's gray, you could use a black, just so that you have a darker value right in the center. And then I brush off my brush a little bit to dry it off and go back in and soak back up just a little bit more of that paint. When you're ready to peel away your tape, if you are using tape for your edges, make sure to go very slowly up and away from your paper at an angle away from it so that you don't tear into it if you do have a little bit of a tear. I like using a low tack tape. I will put it on the screen for you. That works very well for me. And it also works the best if you're using the 100% cotton paper, as the tape tears off of that much more easily than other papers. I'd love to hear in the comments if you get a chance to try it out yourself, and I'll see you next time.